Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of the comprehensive news analysis with the first article that talks about the WTO discussing whether or not a patent waiver should be given to the COVID-19 vaccines and other related medicines of COVID or not. We discussed this topic a few days earlier as well. Just a brief recap. India and South Africa, these two countries came together in October 2020 in the WTO and said that any vaccine and any other related medicine that is related to the treatment of COVID-19 should not be given any patent rights, meaning that irrespective of whoever manufactures this medicine, irrespective of whoever discovers the first vaccine or the most effective vaccine, it should be allowed to be copied by other companies across the world because it is in the best interest of the humankind. Now, when this initiative was first taken by India and South Africa, most of the developed nations, including the US and EU, were dead against it. But now what we are seeing is that after Joe Biden came to power, the US also has started to support this waiver. And now the European Union also is saying that under some conditions, we would be willing to support this waiver. However, the authors here are saying in this article that this is not enough. Why? The reason is that India and South Africa, when they first approached the WTO, they had proposed that everything related to COVID-19 treatment, including vaccines, medicine, any diagnostic equipment, any other related aspect of COVID-19 treatment, all of them should be given a patent waiver. However, the current proposal under discussion, the WTO, which the EU has also supported, is to give patent waiver only to the vaccines and not to other medicines related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, a part of the reason is that there is a big disparity between how much coverage of vaccine we have seen in developed nations and the developing nations. While in the low-income nations, only 14% people have got at least one dose. In developed nations and richer nations, you see that most of the nations are covered almost completely. Let's take an example of New Zealand. New Zealand has covered almost 90% of its population with both the doses. In fact, New Zealand is one of those countries that had been opposing the idea of giving a patent waiver because they were saying that it is against the interest of the corporations that are making these vaccines and medicines. Now, the good part is that finally EU is giving positive signs and they are saying that under some situations, we would allow certain countries to go ahead and copy that formula and make medicines and vaccines at an affordable price. Now, the question is it effective or not? Before going forward, there is one more thing that I would like to remind you here. In this article, you will see the mention of the word Quad multiple times. Now, please don't be confused. The word Quad used here is not for the Quad grouping of India, US, Japan, and Australia. In fact, the word Quad that is used here is for a group of 4 nations or the 4 members of WTO. That is India, South Africa, USA, and EU. These 4 are said to be the biggest players in this ongoing discussion because India and South Africa were the one who first brought this idea. USA was the one who was against this idea earlier, but now they have started to support it, and EU now is supporting this idea as well, although with certain restrictions. So wherever the word Quad is being used in this article, they are referring to these 4 nations. So these 4 members have now come together with a kind of a compromise formula of how we should go about this. Now, what exactly is this? As per this compromise formula, some nations would be allowed to give compulsory licensing. Now, we discussed earlier also a few days back what is compulsory licensing. Let me just repeat quickly. Compulsory licensing simply means that within a country, if a government thinks that a specific medicine is not affordable to the common people and there is a health emergency, a lot of people are dying because they can't afford the vaccine, then the government of that country can allow some third company to make this medicine, to copy that medicine because it is in the public interest. This is called compulsory licensing. Now, the original law about compulsory licensing is that if, let's say, Indian government wants to give compulsory license of an anti-cancer medicine to any local Indian company, then first the government of India should approach the company which is making this medicine and try to get from them a voluntary license. If they don't give voluntary license to make their medicine by other company, then the government of India should go ahead and give the compulsory license to the company of their choice and ask them to manufacture the medicine and sell it at a lower cost. However, as per the current proposal that is being discussed by these 4 member nations, this condition will be waived off. Meaning that now you don't need to go and ask for voluntary license from these vaccine manufacturers. many countries now, mainly the developing nations, can go ahead and take up the compulsory licensing and allow local drug manufacturers, local vaccine manufacturers to make vaccines and sell it at a lower cost. This compromise formula doesn't mean that every country around the world can do this. There are only certain eligible members, only certain countries that will be allowed to use compulsory licensing. Now, who are they? They would be developing member nations of the WTO that have exported less than 10% of the world's export of COVID-19 vaccine doses in 2021. Now, with this particular definition, China will be out of it. So China will not be able to use this compulsory licensing criteria because China has been exporting many more medicines around the world. Also, China might not be really worried about that because they have multiple local vaccines now. So they don't require the composition of vaccines that are used by the Western nations. So they are not really worried about that. India, on the other hand, will be covered under this because the number of vaccines that we have exported around the world are only 2.4% of the global export. So India does stand to gain from this idea. However, the authors here are saying that a part of the problem is that this proposal that CORD or these four members are now giving has many more conditions as compared to what WTO usually demands. Means there have been extra compulsions that have been put on these developing nations. What extra compulsions? For example, the countries have to list all the patents that are covered under the compulsory licenses. Not just this, they would have to give details of how much quantity of vaccines are they producing, how much are they exporting, for how much are they selling to their public, etc. So all of that have to be extremely transparent for the entire world to see. These conditions are not imposed by WTO. These are in fact imposed as a part of this compromise formula being discussed by these core member nations. That is why the authors here don't really like this. The authors are making a point that the entire idea of having a patent waiver is to make it much more easier to make these vaccines, to make them much more affordable, and not to put in a lot more restrictions. Rather, these restrictions are doing the opposite. They would actually be slowing down the pace of manufacturing of these vaccines, so we have to be warned against that. Now, there are a lot of experts around the world which are writing in the international media that although the intention of a patent waiver might seem to be good on paper, but in reality, it might not really help the developing nations as much as we are thinking. And let me tell you why. So there are numbers given by multiple reports that have suggested that companies such as Pfizer, Moderna, BioNTech, the companies which are producing most vaccines for COVID around the world and one of the first to produce these vaccines, are making $65,000 every passing minute. Just imagine the amount of money that they are making. And even then, they are more concerned about their patent not being waived off. We must also understand that when they were working on their vaccines, there were a lot of governments and philanthropists who had given a donation to these companies to come up with this research. In fact, they received over $8 billion in public funding to develop these vaccines. And now it is time for them to give back to the society, which they are not doing. Pfizer and biotech have delivered less than 1% of their total vaccine supplies to low-income countries. Moderna has just delivered 0.2% of their total production to the low-income countries. Thus, while they are filling their profit by supplying the vaccine to the rich nations which can afford any prices, the lower-income nations and the people living in those nations are the ones that are suffering the most. And that is why India and South Africa in October 2020 decided to move to WTO with this proposal. As I said earlier, in the beginning, the proposal was opposed by most of the Western developed nations, including the US and European nations. However, now at least we are seeing the other nations coming together on this proposal. But still, the poor nations would not have it so easy to manufacture these vaccines at an affordable price. And there are many reasons behind that. Part of the reason is the wording and the language used in this proposal and in the WTO resolutions. For example, a WTO member state can authorize the use of patented subject matter that is protected under TRIPS to the extent necessary to address the COVID-19 pandemic. This is what is written in the proposal. But what if after a few months, the WHO says that it is not a pandemic anymore, it has converted into an endemic? Now what happens? Would this proposal then be void? Would the countries now not be able to produce those vaccines or not? There is no clarity on that. Not just this, the eligibility criteria also is not very clear. For instance, the eligibility is limited to developing nations only, that have exported less than 10% of the world's vaccines in 2021. Means China would not be a part of it because they have exported over 10% vaccines. Apart from that, even countries such as Brazil would not be able to take advantage of this because recently Brazil declared that they are not a developing country anymore. So it would now go against their own national interest. These are some of the issues that still need to be addressed in this proposal that is ongoing at the WTO. The next article that we have gives an interesting proposal, that is that India requires an Indian legislative service. Just like we have the Indian administrative service, we have the Indian police service, we also need to have an Indian legislative service. Now the point of the article is the author is saying that recently, that is in September 2021, the Rajya Sabha saw a new Secretary General in the form of Dr. PPK Ramcharyulu. Now this was a very interesting step, in the sense that he is not an IAS officer, he is not a bureaucrat. In fact, he joined the Rajya Sabha as a secretariat staff and has been promoted year after year to now reach the position of Secretary General. This is a welcome step because usually the position of Secretary General is occupied by bureaucrats, either who are working or who have already retired. Although this was a good beginning, but he was replaced within 3 months by Mr. P.C. Modi, who is a retired IRS officer. Thus, this beginning was only for 3 months and should be extended much further. The author says that since 1952, 11 Secretary Generals have served in the Rajya Sabha. Except for some who have been lateral entry staff, most of the Secretary Generals are actually bureaucrats or retired bureaucrats. In fact, the tradition goes back to the very first parliament. In 1952, the Rajya Sabha opted for its first Secretary General in the form of Mr. S. N. Mukherjee, who was a civil servant. This was very weird because at that time, we even had Legislative Assembly Department which was attached to the Central Legislative Assembly. These had people who were experts in the parliamentary proceedings and they were much more suited to work in the parliament as a Secretary General. But even then, a former bureaucrat was preferred over those people who are the staff of the parliament itself. Since 1993, all the Secretary Generals of the Rajya Sabha have been from the civil services only. This is what the author does not like. Now, if you look at the Constitution of India, Article 98 says that there have to be separate secretariats for the two houses of the parliament. Now, secretariat simply means a staff of the parliament that would help in the proceedings of the Lok Sabha and of the Rajya Sabha respectively. Secretary General is the head of that staff. He or she is responsible for ensuring that the proceedings of the house go on smoothly. So much so that Secretary General is given a rank equivalent to that of Cabinet Secretary, and he is the third most important functionary in the Rajya Sabha after the chairman of Rajya Sabha and the deputy chairman of Rajya Sabha. So it is very obvious that the Secretary General must have a lot of knowledge and experience about the parliamentary proceedings, parliamentary practices, how has the parliament functioned over the years, and if there is a deadlock, how to resolve that, what rules to follow in certain situations. That is why it is so important the person who is at that position should have a lot of experience. Now, the interesting part is, unlike the Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha has had a much better history in that regard. In fact, 9 of the staff members of Lok Sabha have raised to become the Secretary Generals of Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha must also learn from this example. The author says that when civil servants are hired at the post of Secretary General, there is a conflict of interest because this goes against the concept of separation of powers. Now understand this. Parliament is a part of the legislative arm of the government, while the civil servants are the executive arm of the government. The entire concept of separation of powers is that the legislative and the executive should be separate from each other. But by appointing civil servants or former civil servants at such a key position in the parliament, we are going against the idea of the separation of powers, and we are ensuring that there is much more interference of the government in running the parliament, which should not happen. A strong parliament means that the executive should be answerable. Question must be asked to the executive rather than having the executive himself run the parliament, which should not happen. In the last part of the article, the author is coming back to the heading of the article. The author says that the best way to resolve this is to have an all India service like service called the Indian Legislative Service. He says that there are thousands of legislative bodies in India, starting from the parliament, state legislatures, and we have the municipalities, we have the panchayats, etc. And all these legislative bodies require a secretariat staff who will help them in their working. Thus, since we have a requirement of such a large staff, it is only prudent if we have such a legislative service across the country. As you would all know, Rajya Sabha under Article 312 has the power to initiate the creation of a new All India service in the national interest by passing a resolution by a special majority. This is what should be done as per the author. An example that we can follow is of the United Kingdom, in which there is a specific staff called the Clerk of the House of Commons who have been appointed from the legislative staff pool. They are the ones who are appointed at key positions to run the parliament, and the same should be followed in India. Now, as most of you would know, we have three All India services right now: the IAS, the Indian Police Service, and the Indian Forest Service. The Constitution of India, however, provides a provision for creation of a new All India service as well, as we just read. The entire article is based on the idea of separation of powers. That is, the three arms of the government. That is, the executive, legislative, and the judiciary must be separate from each other and must not be dependent on each other. This idea of separation of powers, which is now seen in almost every modern democracy across the world, actually started in ancient Greece and was first seen in the works of Aristotle. Now, it's very easy to understand what would happen if this separation of powers is not met. Just imagine any dynasty that ruled over India. In those dynasties, there used to be one single person who was the ruler also, who was the chief judge also. He would decide what punishment to give, what punishment not to give. He would make the policies also. He would implement the policies also. In simple terms, one single ruler was performing the function of legislative, executive, and the judiciary, means there was no separation of powers. Similarly, today look at countries such as North Korea, where one single person has all the powers, which amounts to dictatorship. So the easiest way to ensure that there is no dictatorship in your country is to ensure that there is separation of powers between different organs of the government. Now, after Aristotle first mentioned it and tried to adopt it in ancient Greece, in modern history, the idea was first adopted by the French philosopher Montesquieu, who wrote it in his book called The Spirit of Laws. And now it is an integral part of almost all modern democracies, including India, UK, US, Canada, Australia, etc. Now, the form of separation of powers may be separate from each other. For example, in India, although we have separation of powers, but our executive, that is the ministers, are a part of the legislative. In order to become a minister in India, you have to be a part of legislative. In US, however, that is not the same. The secretaries or the ministers or the executives, whatever you call them, are different, and the legislative is different. So although all the countries might argue that they follow the concept of separation of powers, their practice and their implementation might be different as compared to the other countries around the world. The next article is focused on the National Land Monetization Corporation. This was an idea that was first declared by the finance minister during the budget speech. The finance minister had said that the government of India plans to monetize all the land resources that we have. Now, the idea is that government's ministries such as the Defense Ministry, Railway Ministry, Home Ministry, etc., all of them have a lot of land under them. In fact, so much so that we have a separate service for that in the Civil Service Examination, that is the Indian Defense Estates Services. They just have to manage all the defense land, all the military land, all the cantonment areas that we have. So the government and its ministries have a lot of resources in the form of land. Some of it is being utilized, but a lot of it is just lying vacant without earning any money for the government of India. So the government now plans to monetize those land resources, and in order to do that, a new agency has been formed called the National Land Monetization Corporation, which has been given the responsibility to carry out the monetization activities for the public sector undertaking specifically. This corporation will work under the Ministry of Finance and has been given multiple objectives. Apart from carrying out monetization, they will also act as advisory bodies and support other government entities and central public sector enterprises to identify what resources can be monetized in the future so that they can become far more efficient. Now, there's a lot of confusion in the mind of the people when they read this. The word monetization is not privatization. So do understand this. The word monetization doesn't mean that the government is now selling their resources to the private companies. That is not happening. Monetization simply means transferring the revenue right. For example, let's assume the Ministry of Defense has a big area of 100 acres in a place such as Delhi. Now, what they will do is they will ask any private player, do you want to use this area for your own manufacturing, or do you want to use this area to carry out your activities? If they say yes, then the government would take a part of their revenue generated from that area, and the government would also take an upfront payment from those corporates. But that land will still remain Government of India's land only. So it is not a transfer of asset. It's more about just earning money from them for the long run. This contract will be signed for a specific period of time. The government will get an upfront payment from that private entity and also a share of the revenue generated from that asset. In order to ensure that this reaps the most benefit for the government, the NLMC will hire expert professionals from the private sector because it would require a lot of work. Professionals would have to come in and they would have to estimate what would be the perfect value for this asset so that they can quote it in the market. They would have to negotiate the best terms possible for the government, etc. And that is why, rather than depending on the bureaucrats, the government is trying to hire professionals from the private sector. Now, as I said earlier, there is huge amount of land that is available with certain government ministries, including the Defense Ministry, Railway Ministry, etc. And that is what is being targeted. Not just this, even government companies such as MTNL, BSNL, BPCL, all of these also have a lot of land asset with them, and that will be monetized in the times to come. Although this seemed like a great plan on paper, but in reality, converting it into real income for the government might be a challenge. Now, why is that? This is because whenever the government of India has set up any target for itself for disinvestment, they have never been able to meet that target. For example, in the financial year 2021-22, government was only able to raise 12,423 crore, which is much lower as compared to their target of 1.75 lakh crore. Not just this, government's efforts to introduce a PPP, that is public-private partnership model for Indian Railways, also has not really given great results. As you would know, the Indian government had invited certain bids from private companies if they would like to take over the railway operations on certain areas, but they did not really receive any meaningful bid. So there might not be a lot of interest among the private entities to take up the government on this offer. Now, this idea of monetizing the government asset has been seen across the world in many countries. In many of these nations, it has not really given the kind of result that we had hoped for. Let me give you a few examples. In 2013, the Australian government leased their two big ports, that is Port Kembla and Port Botany near Sydney, but the government of Australia were not really able to get the kind of earning that they had hoped for. In fact, the one lesson from Australia that is now being seen around the world is, if the government wants to monetize their assets or they want to privatize the economy, do it to improve the efficiency and not to earn money. What seems to be the case here is that the government is monetizing all these assets because they want to earn more money. That is what we can see when the government says that we will take money upfront and then we'll also take a share of revenue, etc. So rather than the focus being on whether or not these assets are being utilized well or not, whether or not it is adding to the economy or not, whether or not it is making the government more efficient or not, the focus here seems to be on the government's earning capacity and nothing else. This is a mistake that we should not commit if we see models across the world. Let's take an example of Singapore also. Singapore had to nationalize their suburban trains and signaling systems because the private sector just did not have any money to run these operations, and the passengers, the people who were using these services, had become very angry and the government had to take it over eventually. There's another example of Australia from the New South Wales, where electricity prices doubled within 5 years when the government of Australia privatized electricity poles and wires. The government finally had to step in and make sure that they lower the consumer burden. This kind of an example can be a warning for India, because while we are going on this route, we also have to make sure that the end consumer does not have an extra burden on his or her pocket. The next article is focusing on a very interesting development that is taking place in Finland. So what has happened is Microsoft has partnered with a Finnish energy company called Fortum. And what they're doing is that in Finland, Microsoft is setting up its own data centers. Now, data centers means places where there is a lot of data that is stored by the IT companies and other companies. So there are a lot of servers, etc., routers, switches that are in place. In order to operate these data centers, a lot of electricity is required and it generates a lot of heat. These equipments get heated up. Now, Microsoft is saying that we will use this heat that is being generated from the data centers and we will transmit that heat energy to a lot of homes in Finland, because Finland is a place where there's a lot of cold weather and the government of Finland anyways has to supply a lot of heat energy to their houses in Finland. So Microsoft is saying that rather than wasting all the heat energy that the data centers are developing, we would rather be using that to transmit it to the houses so that we can save on the energy and we can use this heat waste that is being generated by the data centers. Now, this is not the first time that any company is thinking in that direction. What Microsoft is doing is that they will be doing it on a much larger scale. But even companies such as Facebook and Amazon have been doing this kind of a project in a smaller scale in nations such as Denmark. Now, as I explained, data center is that facility where the company would have to store all the data to ensure it is safe. In very simple terms, see, when you use Google Drive or when you use Facebook, you upload your photos, you upload your videos, where does it go? That data has to be stored somewhere, right? So Google, Facebook, all of them have to set up all these huge data centers where all that data is stored and it is safeguarded. They usually choose countries which have a colder weather because these data centers manufacture a lot of heat because they are constantly running and they also require a constant supply of electricity. In fact, so much so that it is said that about 75% of data centers electricity gets converted into heat waste. So rather than just letting it go, it is always advisable if you can use this in some way or the other. That is what Microsoft is saying that we will be doing in Finland. Now, at a global level, data centers consume about 200 terawatt hours of electricity, which is more than 1% of the world's total electricity. And the estimate is it will only increase in the coming years. There are some countries which are specially favored by these companies who set up their data centers because of their liberal policies, because of their stable government, such as Ireland. Ireland's energy regulator, in fact, says that by 2027, 30% of their country's electricity might only be used for these data centers. And that presents a big opportunity for countries such as Ireland. Not just this, Microsoft is saying that their initiative of using this heat and supplying it to houses, businesses, and public buildings would reduce 4 lakh tons of CO2, which would have been produced otherwise by burning of coal to supply heat to these houses. Now, at present, how Finland works is they have a system called district heating. District heating means that in every district, there is a centralized location where the government agency generates heat, maybe by burning coal or other energy resources, and then they supply this heat in the form of hot water from insulated underground pipes to different houses, and people then use it as per their requirement. This mechanism of district heating is very common in the Nordic and in the Baltic nations and in nations such as Russia and China, mainly in those areas where there is a lot of cold weather and people require constant supply of heat energy. As I said earlier, Facebook is in fact using this system in Denmark. Apple is also planning the same. Now, you might not have noticed this, but data center is something that the government of India has been focusing on a lot in the past few years. In fact, if you just do a search online, you will see that India is fast becoming a very attractive destination for setting up data centers. In fact, India right now is home to over 80 third-party data centers, and this market is expected to grow much more in the coming 5 or 10 years. Right now, the cities that are in focus in India are Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, and Bangalore, where most of the data centers are located. Now, let me just give you a brief explanation about why data centers are so important. You would have seen that a few months back, the government of India was asking Twitter to block a few accounts, or the government of India asked Facebook or Twitter to give information about their users. Usually you will see that IT companies, be it Facebook, Twitter, etc., social media companies, they set up their servers or data centers outside India, The Indian government does not like that. Why? Because the Indian government says that when you set up data centers outside India, meaning that the information of Indian citizens is stored overseas. So the laws of the government of India, the laws made by the parliament, would not apply to those data centers because they are not placed in India. In fact, the government of India has been trying extremely hard to ask companies such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc. to set up their data centers in India so that the government of India's laws can apply to them and they can extract information from these data centers for the purpose of national security. These companies, on the other hand, are aware of this. They don't want the government's interference in their working, and they deliberately ensure that they don't set up their data centers in India. And they choose countries which are much more liberal, which give them much better policies and give them tax exemptions such as Ireland, Denmark, Finland, etc. Now, realizing the potential in the data center business, the government of India, in fact, in 2020, released a draft data center policy. Now, let's see what are the main provisions of this. This draft data center policy said that the government will try to provide infrastructure support for data center sector, especially in sectors such as railways, roadways, power, etc. The government will ensure that there is a single window time-bound clearance given to any company that wants to set up their data center in India. Not just this, data centers will be declared as essential service under the Essential Service Act, meaning that there will be continuity of services even when there are calamities or crises, etc. For instance, when the COVID-19 lockdown was announced by the government, if you remember, the government announced that people who work in the essential services, they will still be allowed to go out and work, others would not be. So that is when the government is saying that even data centers would be a part of essential services. So their job, etc., will continue 24/7, even if there are natural calamities or a crisis situation in the country. The other need to have a data center policy is with increasing population, with increasing trend of data creation in India, we need to ensure that our local data remains localized and is covered under the Indian law. For that, it is extremely important for these data centers to be set up in India and not to other countries across the world. That is what will ensure protection of digital sovereignty of the country. With the size of digital economy of India growing at an extremely fast pace, this policy was required to ensure that the companies find it favorable and attracted to set up their data centers in India, and not just in the main metro areas of Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, but also in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. These were the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number 1. Elaborate on the merits of having an Indian legislative service. How can a new All India service be created in India? Second, what is a data center? Explain the role played by data centers in adding to the global carbon footprint. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.